500 people entered the cursed Jamestown colony in Virginia between 1607 and 1610. Only about 60 of those poor souls survived. Historians had only a handful of eyewitness reports of the events until now. It was a letter written by one of the colony members during this starving time in Jamestown. It has recently come to light, the contents of which will shock and horrify you. Although the miraculously preserved document has been verified as from the mid to late 1600s, historians still doubt the veracity of this chilling statement. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources allowed our team to transcribe this document so that the public can decide for themselves the truth of this witness's testimony. We have translated this account into modern-day English. The true happenings of the starvation time at Jamestown, winter 1608, as witnessed by William May. Death came for us, slowly. Once the dogs and cats were consumed, we fell to eating vermin, and then we chewed upon our boots as we slid into starvation. And to add to our despair, a savage storm came from the east and raged so black that we feared it would tear our souls from our bones. We became like animals as the bitter cold stripped the last kindness from our hearts. Our agony to survive consumed us above all else. But we were mere strangers in this strange land. We knew nothing of the dark and ancient gods that prowled this world. We did not know that this storm had brought into our midst a horror far worse than the hunger that ate us from within, worse by far than death. It began with Jeremiah Blackstone. Once a devout man, he drew back from prayers and became taciturn and sullen. He set to leaving each morning through the palisade and returning under the cover of darkness. It was exceedingly strange that he did not succumb to those arrows and machetes of the Powhatan Indians as dozens of our starving fellows had done. So once within our walls, he would pace our encampment like a wild beast, to and fro, often stopping suddenly in his tracks. And then he would cock his ear as though called by someone and let out this chilling chuckle. This happened often, as though he were sharing some kind of dark joke with the blind eye of the moon. It was the first sign of the horrors to come. We assumed he had taken leave of his senses. All of us, to a man, had stared into the abyss of our own demise and found our sanity shaken. Yet, he frightened me in a deep way that I could not explain. My skin would crawl when he drew near. His good wife, Rachel, trailed her once loving husband's steps. We watched her follow him like an emaciated shadow, often calling out his name or trying to take his arm, but he would shrug her off, almost like she was a stranger, or fix her with a stare that reduced her to anguished howls. Meanwhile, our numbers dwindled daily, the camp heavy with the groans and the unheeded prayers of our dying. Far worse than the relentless hunger, a wild animal had found our colony and nightly made a feast of us few remaining souls. The Larson family was the first to fall prey to this evil. When they failed to attend prayers, we searched the family in the shambles of their once proud cabin. A black swarm of flies rose furiously as we approached, and then a stench so thick with dizzy rot arose that my empty stomach roiled and burned inside me. Before us was a spectacle of such gore that Satan himself would draw back in revulsion. Samuel had been reduced to tattered bones, even his face half devoured and eyeless. And Fran lay on her back in a pool of gore. And God help me, her belly was opened up like a ragged cave and emptied of her unborn child. Of little Hetty, their daughter, there was no sign, only scraps of her honey blonde hair attached to the red meat of her precious head. We retreated without speaking, each of us struggling to make sense of this horror. The next night, Raymond Goodson and Timothy Leeds were ripped apart in a frenzy of ravenous teeth and claws. Many believed this to be the Powhatan who were exacting revenge on our bodies. Yet how could they climb the palisade and commit this butchery without anyone hearing a sound? We decided there and then that each night we would post a guard to watch the periphery of our encampment. We made our grim patrol of the large spiked timbers of the fort, and we did this despite our ailing bodies calling out for blessed sleep. Yet each morning revealed fresh horrors as our starved fellow sufferers fell to the beast. And soon the freshly dug graves outnumbered us 5-1. The only thing being fed in that unspeakable time was the earth. And Jeremiah seemed even more altered in those passing days. As I watched in growing dread, he seemed to grow larger as the rest of us shrunk into our bones. He stood taller, muscled under his tattered clothes, and impervious to the cold. His gaze shone with a slick malice, and the whites of his eyes turned as red as fresh meat. A terrible suspicion began to dawn on me that there was something feral about the way that he stared at us, something almost inhuman. I grew to fear his blue eyes shining white against their bloody rims. Still, he continued to leave the camp, only emerging under the cover of night. We speculated whether he hunted outside the fort and jealousy kept his kills for himself. How else could this man be growing stronger and stronger each day while we counted out bones in our starving bodies? Then his wife, Rachel, failed to join our morning prayers. I knew it was my duty to find out how she fared. I waited until Jeremiah slipped out of the palisades, and I crept in the shadows to their cabin. The smell hit me all at once, the reek of dizzy rot. With cold in my veins, I leaned behind a pile of half-burned beams, and I found her, or at least part of her. Rachel had been gnawed upon like a hastily devoured carcass. Her body was reduced to a dismembered head and a ragged, bloody calf bone. I was sickened to note that her tongue had been torn out, leaving only a blackened root. And her gaping mouth was filled with what I first thought to be snow, but was salt. No wild animal alive had the wherewithal to preserve their prey. What was left of her bore the notched bites of a man, her husband, Jeremiah. As though on fire, I ran out, crying out for aid from those few starving creatures left alive. Will Pierce, Peter Porey, and Walter Russell, the surgeon, managed to rouse themselves to my dry and ragged pleas, and of course, Reverend Hunt, though his health was dire. And then we set out to rally our fellows who were Christian enough yet to care for their souls beyond their hunger. We mustered 8 of us, some with crude weapons such as hoes and axes. George Hill, Richard Molyneux, and Peter Keffer joined us with their muskets. We stepped outside the palisades to the path, bracing ourselves for the Powhatan arrows. We saw the Indians moving in our periphery, and the Reverend called out to them in their native tongue. With broken Algonquian, he explained that we came to hunt a devil of our own, and we meant them no harm. And not far from the palisade, we discovered with dread the many souls who had ventured outside to seek food and met their grisly fate. As we viewed their tattered remnants, we doubted that the men had fallen to the Indians at all. It became clear that they had become prey of the same ravenous creature that had so beset our wretched camp. We came across a fresh trail of blood. We followed it through the trees to an opening. Jeremiah stood with his massive back to us, his hands covered in blood up to his giant elbows. Russell called out his name, and Jeremiah slowly turned around. He was giggling and furiously chewing. And what made us tremble with fear was that he was chewing his own lips to bloody tassels. His smile was terrible to see, without the cover of his lips. His teeth shone through the meat of his raw gums in a rictus grin. He unfurled to a great height before us as though his human frame were a paltry disguise. And then he leaned toward us and roared. It was a sound that was not human or animal, but the very sound of a demon from hell. We were enthralled for a moment, and then musket shots roared past me. I watched the shots pierce his body. He still stood unfazed. He still smiled, his terrible bloody-toothed grin. Another volley rang out. And then we set against him with musket, knife, hoe, axe, our fists, anything to bring him down. Still, he stood. His long tongue licked the last slivers of his red, frayed lips. In less than one blink, he had Jonas Prophet in either hand. In one great tear, he ripped him apart, and then he gorged on the man's beating heart in great, tearing gulps. Even as the man yet screamed, our minds spun from the horror. God forgive us, we ran back to our camp, as though flying, even as we heard the rending of flesh and the cracking of bones behind us. We ran. Once back in the fort, we stood numb, horrified, gasping for air. And it was then that the gunner Peter Keffer spoke up. Keffer was a difficult man, quick to rage and short on social graces. However, he was a trapper who had spent time before us in this godly new world, and he bore the proof. A Powhatan scalping had left half of his fine black hair puckered and pinched in a deep pink scar. "'Tis no man, 'tis a Wendigo," he told us as we battled to take in his words. "Their demons come on a foul wind brought by bitter winter. I once met the likes when I took shelter with the Manahawks during a tempest," he told us. "See, the devil takes over the soul with wicked urges and a hunger for human flesh," he explained, with his great craggy brow furrowed in fear. And he went on to tell us that the evil spirit could spread from man to man and devour entire villages unless stopped. "Good God, man, how do you kill such a demon?" I asked. "You must burn out his evil heart," he replied, gesturing towards his chest with a clawed hand. That night we set a grisly trap for Jeremiah and roused each able-bodied man to help. We left the body of a newly dead member of our tribe, young Elizabeth, as a lure for the beast. It pained to use that fair young creature for such an ungodly role, but Reverend Hunt assured us that she would be rewarded in the hereafter, and then we waited. I have never known a fear that consumed my blood as I felt that night. We spied Jeremiah moving crabwise through the dying light. He paused, and he sniffed the air. His demonic face bristled in the moonlight. Then he dropped to all fours and licked at the trail of blood in the dirt. The monster raced and fell upon that young girl. At first, he used claws and teeth in a frenzy to eat her flesh, but then he used a dull blade of an axe to pry open her skull. He sucked at her brain like meat from a crab shell. We attacked all at once, again wielding muskets and swords and axes and any sharp object we could muster. Still the devil he roared and flailed. He took Pori and Hill, gutting them in one furious slash of his claws, and still we continued to advance. In a moment we had hacked off an arm, and then we cut through him. His haunches clung to his spine by only gristle. I labored to sever his great neck, blow by blow. All the while he roared and he snapped. Eventually I managed to cut his head from his body, yet the teeth and bloody tongue still cursed and bit at us. It was Miller who took the beast's eyes. He hacked out those blue orbs from their bloody sockets. But alas, he was not careful enough to avoid the monster's gaze, as we were later to find out. We were beyond exhausted. Our wasted bodies rocked with pains and aches, and still we fought. Blow by blow, we reduced that monster to gore-stained pieces. Reverend Hunt called for us to take out the demon's heart. Brave Molyneux grasped that foul, still-beating organ, and it was the Reverend's idea to burn the monster outside the gates. If the Powhatan are besieging us to protect themselves from this evil, let them know that we have vanquished this devil. Perhaps they will bring much-needed food, or allow us out of the fort to hunt. We carried the carcass, me holding the head by its greasy, gory thicket of hair, and we built a crude altar. We noted the natives standing watch, silhouetted in the light of the full moon. Once the flames were roaring, we cast the grisly remains of the beast onto the fire. Then, as God as my witness, the disembodied head near my feet uttered a growl and bit towards my feet. I kicked that cursed face into the burning heart of the fire. That night, Miller began to act strangely and drew away from the warmth of our company. He had taken on that staring look of Jeremiah, and we watched in dread as he too began to cock his head as though called by the devil. We found him later in the old kitchen. He had unburied the remains of the child Elizabeth and had even pried shreds of skin from her face. He roared the same bitter screech as Jeremiah, and we did what we had to do to save that poor man's soul. Soon he joined Jeremiah on the fire. Several men who could still travel packed their meager belongings. They aimed to take the Swallow and sail her back home from the terror of this new world. Our ragged crew decided to stay. Despite the hunger and fear, we stayed to aid my brave fellow colonists, should that foul spirit return. Under Reverend Hunt's urging, we swore to never speak of that savage entity. He felt that speaking of the demon would grant that beast more power. So, as one, the remainder of the colony agreed to blame that ill fate of our companions on human design, and I have kept this secret burning in me until now. I feel it is my duty to commit my experiences to paper and tell the world what truly happened in James City. Hereby, I hope to warn the new travelers of the dangers in this new world that are more vast and terrifying than they could ever imagine. Signed, William May, gentleman from the first colony of Jamestown, First Supply, 1608 to 1610. In 2020, Mark Evans of Richmond unearthed the above ancient document from a chest of drawers he purchased from an antique dealer in Virginia. He recognized the age of the missive, addressed to the Virginia Company of London, and he brought this document to the attention of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and there, forensic scientist Albert Mansfield, Ph.D., confirmed through ink dating that the letter was indeed dated from the 1600s. Forensic psychologist Betty Arnheim believes that the Wendigo was a collective delusion brought on by the severe physical and psychological stress those early pioneers underwent. However, she noted with interest that only a few survivors ever told of the terrors they endured, perhaps in horror of their own cannibalism. Or was the silence of the 60 survivors the real evidence of a pact? In 2012, archaeologist William Kelso uncovered the remains of an unidentified girl in the Jamestown site. The skull and one shin bone showed signs of being cannibalized. Here's the poor child's facial reconstruction. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.